Let's welcome Lauren. Thank you.
Thank you, Emilia. Well, it is our 38th meeting and our 40th canto, so I think that's quite exciting. But in fact, this is not my brainchild. In reading and commenting on the Divine Comedy, we are taking part in an unbroken tradition that began in 1373, when the city fathers of Florence had the wisdom to invite Giovanni Boccaccio to comment on the Divine Comedy, read and comment on the Divine Comedy for the moral edification of the populace. And ever since then, people have been doing it, including us. So it's very exciting to be part of that long tradition, to trace ourselves back to the 14th. And I'd like to dedicate this evening to the memory of Father Barth, who was the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Boston College from 1988 to 1999. Father Barth was a man who loved the wisdom and music of poetry. And although he did not attend the Lectura Dantis, I have always felt that he was with us in spirit. Tonight, as Emilio said, we're taking on Canto 6 of Purgatorio. I had no idea how tough this was going to be when I raised my hand. But I'd like to begin with some general comments about the 14th century in Italy and a little bit about Purgatorio, a few ideas about Purgatorio, and then turn to the canto. I'd also like to mention the works that were important to me in the preparation of this task. Dante's Political Purgatorio by John Scott, the classic The Political Vision of the Divine Comedy by Joan Ferrante, Dante's Poets by Teodolinda Barolini, and the translations and notes of Hollander and Hollander and Martinez and Derling were the most important, I think. The 13th and 14th centuries were a time of tremendous turmoil in Italy. There was war between the popes and the Ghibellines. That was called Bella. Those were real Latin wars. And then there were territorial wars between local lords. Those were called guerre. Those weren't as serious, but they caused as much havoc. And there were civil wars in many cities between clans, factions, and between nobles and the emerging merchant class. We even have riots by the humble wool workers in the late 14th century, the Ciompi in Florence and other Italian and European cities. Besides the territorial wars, there were ideological wars, which were fought in public lecture halls and probably in taverns and apothecaries and barber shops. And questions like what constituted legitimate government were important at that time. Should power be in the hands of those who had acquired it through violence? Should we have aristocratic government? Is the consent of the people important, or only the consent of the rich? How does government control the local nobility when it behaves badly? We could be asking that question today. What is the meaning of this enormous new wealth of the 14th century? And how did one curb the growing wealth and temporal power of the church, which menaced the autonomy of European states? And some of these questions are taken up by Dante in Canto 6 of Purgatorio. You will recall that Purgatorio is a creation of the Middle Ages. This is what Jacques Le Goff, the lesson he brought home, although we knew it before. And it's defined by a new sense of linear time, time that could be measured and used, employed. Purgatorio is really a hell. Cleanses sins in time and delivers salvation. And it's the only realm after death that will disappear in time, will end at the end of time. And I recall this essential characteristic of Purgatorio because we're reading a political canto. And as you know, the sixth canto of each cantica, of each canticle, often has an explicitly political message. The doctrine of purgatory becomes important at the same time as the doctrine of good government in many parts of Europe. Both the divine and the human institution seem to be predicated on the idea that man could be guided toward virtue, man could be perfected. So what was good government? In Dante's day, scholars returned to the teachings of Aristotle and the idea that the secular state was defined as a product of man's nature. This is J.P. Canning's definition. Dante argued that good government should assist mankind in the proper exercise of free will, thereby advancing the individual's prospect of salvation. Dante believed that. And what stood in the way of good government was our lust for the she-wolf, our greed, the lupa. Dante explains this in the final, are you with me? Yeah. Dante explains this in the final chapter of the Monarchia. He says, man has two natures. One is human and one is divine. So God has set up two goals for mankind. The first, happiness in life, typified by the earthly paradise, and the second, happiness in eternal life, signified by heavenly paradise. However, human greed is such that humanity requires two mutually independent safeguards or guides to ensure the proper exercise of free will, to ensure that we live well. The Supreme Pontiff, who is to lead humanity to eternal life in accordance with Revelation, and the Emperor, who in accordance with philosophical teaching must lead to temporal happiness. This is fundamental to Dante's belief. Dante saw the Emperor, the successor to Augustus and then Tiberius, under whose reign Christ was crucified and man was saved, as the only temporal rulers powerful and rich enough to be free from the attraction of the she-wolf, to escape cupidigia, or greed. Only the emperor, lord of the temporal realm, nurtured by philosophy and supremely humble, could be without greed. So that both the papacy in Dante's mind and the empire were providential institutions. This is the baseline. And now we get back to reality, to history. The German emperors of the first decade of the 14th century, Dante's lifetime, in our Canto, we have German Albert, and we also have his father, and there's mention of his son. They had not responded to their providential mission. They had not sought legitimate coronation in Rome, and they had neglected Italy, and they had allowed the church to increase its temporal dominion there, often in exchange for territories elsewhere. So they would receive a part of Switzerland, but give up a part of Italy to the church. Not nurtured on philosophy, they had not achieved that state of perfect humility, not risen above greed and dedicated their lives to providential purpose. Dante chastises German Albert in lines 97 to 105 of our Canto. And German here does not really signify his nationality, but his failure to become Roman Albert, Rex Romanorum, I think. In several extant and really exultant letters, we see that Dante pinned his hopes for the creation of a good government on earth on the young Emperor Henry VII, a prince who embraced the imperial myth of an emperor as a guardian of peace and justice. Henry, in what many historians view as a quixotic quest, crossed the Alps to reconquer imperial territory in Italy in 1310. So Dante had already begun the Commedia. And he was greeted as a liberator by some and as a dangerous tyrant by others, including the Florentines. Dante saw Florence at the core of the rebellion against Henry, and he urged the young Henry to destroy the city, to root out this monstrous perversion in Epistle 7, which dates from the spring of 1311. And the Florentines responded by excluding Dante from a general amnesty, which they issued in September of 1311. Henry was crowned emperor in Rome on June 29, 1312, but he died of malaria 8 months later. So this was more or less the end of Dante's dream. But most of the composition of Purgatorio took place during Henry's ascent into Italy, as Scott points out, or this is Scott's theory. So what strikes the reader today as an arcane historical detail, I could see your eyes glazing over as I was talking about Henry VII, was vital and urgent for Dante, the descent of Henry VII into Italy. Buonasera. And now let's turn to the Canto. We're still on the shores of Purgatory. In other words, we're in anti-Purgatory. The anti-Purgatory of the excommunicate and the late repentant. If you'll recall, we find the indolent here. Belacqua was our example. We find the unabsolved. Dante has a meeting with Manfred, the son of Frederick II. And we find the negligent rulers. We're in the domain of the negligent rulers now. And in this canto, Virgil and Dante meet Sordello, who will be their guide in Canto 7, the next canto, the Valley of the Princes, and Canto 8. And finally in Canto 9, is that November or January? Dante will, January, the Dante will ascend into Purgatory. It takes a while for good things to happen. This canto is divided into 3 parts, and 2 are quite brief, and 1 is long. It's a long, bitter apostrophe by the narrator, and that's where we'll focus our discussion. In lines 1 through 56, the pilgrim and Virgil are surrounded by a crowd of souls who are begging Dante to remind their living relatives to pray for their speedy release from bondage. These souls are compared to losers in a game of Zara, a game of chance played with 3 dice. We have the word hazard from Zara, so it gives you a sense of what that game was like. I think they're confused by their loss, by their failure to find reward in the afterlife. And the extended simile reminds us that Italian politics is not being guided by providence or even by fortune, but by raw chance. There's 6 powerful men who are mentioned, all of whom died violent deaths in the end of the 13th century. They're recently dead. I don't want to spend time on this, but we will mention a few. The first in lines 13 and 14 is the Aretine. The Aretine was a judge. And because we have this long tradition of readers and commentators on the Divine Comedy, we have an idea of who this judge was. That's the only way we can tell. And according to the early commentators, who of course could be wrong, it was Benincasa da Laterina. And any edition of the Commedia with notes can tell you that. So you don't have to take notes. He sentenced the brother of Gino di Tacco, a Sienese highwayman, who comes back in the Decameron, to die. And he was, in turn, murdered by Gino. Boccaccio admires him, actually. In line 15, there's mention of a Ghibelline of Arezzo who attacked the exiled Aretine Guelphs and was killed. His name is Guccio de Tarlati di Pietramala. Not very important, I don't think. Lines 16 through 18, I could be wrong, but I didn't feel they were very important, the details. Lines 16 through 18, Federico Novello is named, and he died in the same attack against the exiled Aretine Guelphs. Quel da Pisa is the son of Marzucco degli Scorignani, a widely respected Pisan judge who became a Franciscan in 1286. And his forbearance after the murder of his son by Ugolino, the famous Ugolino, in 1287, the order of the murder, is here remembered by Dante. Ugolino has his fingerprints all over this canto. This is a canto about civic violence, about civic failure. All but the last of these souls is Italian. And Pierre de la Brosse was the chamberlain of Philip III, or Philip the Bold of France. And each Italian death reminds us of the failure of civic government in Italy. But the pilgrim Dante is confused by the whole scene. He's confused by their request that they be remembered by family whose prayers would then mitigate their punishment. And this is an example of the limits of Virgil's Aeneas as urtext for Dante. Dante says to Virgil, you state very plainly, this is line 28, that prayers cannot bend the will of heaven. It's referring to the Aeneid 6:3-7-6. And Virgil responds that yes, he did say that. Dante did understand correctly what he had said. However, that was before the coming of Christ. And now, love can fulfill in a minute, in a point, in an instant, what the soul's lingering in purgatory are attempting to fulfill through many years. But he also tells Dante, let's not talk about this. Why don't you wait until you meet she who shall be the light between truth and intellect. This is line 45. Why don't you bring up this theological question when you meet Beatrice, he's saying. And you'll be meeting her right at the summit of the mountain. And she'll be smiling and she'll be happy. And of course, Dante is no longer weary when he hears that he's going to meet Beatrice at the summit of the mountain. As a matter of fact, he wants to start moving a little faster because the day is coming to an end. And Virgil tells him no, that the pilgrims cannot move during the night on the mountain of Purgatory, and that they would be spending at least one night here. In part 2, 58-75, Virgil points to a soul, must be around 58 or 59, sola soletta, who will show them the way, he hopes. And this soul stands in obvious contrast to the crowd of souls importuning Dante at the opening of the canto. And I think this is a canto mostly based on contrast, so I haven't really followed that up. The narrator describes the soul in lines 61-63 as silent and slow. He's a magnanimous soul, according to Aquinas' definition of the magnanimous character, of great nobility and dignity. He even seems to acquire some mass. He's usually portrayed by artists as a Rodin penseur type. I don't know if you've seen Rodin's penseur. He does not answer Virgil's question, but instead he asks the travelers who they are and where they are from. And as Virgil begins to respond, Mantua, he rises up, identifies himself as Sordello, a fellow citizen of Mantua, and embraces Virgil. So the two shades are embracing. Excuse me. And the point here is that the peace of nations begins with the peace of citizens. And this is a precept in Aristotle and in Augustine, and Dante repeats it in his Convivio. And it's dramatized in this encounter. We could read it. It's line 74. O Mantuan, I am Sordello from your land, and each embraced the other. It's not very impressive in English. It sounds a little better in Italian. The warm expression of brotherhood between the two Mantuans of different millennia provokes an outburst by the narrator, not by Sordello. This is not the narrator's first apostrophe or invective or outburst, but it's the longest and the angriest. And we have to ask why the author concedes this diatribe to the narrator rather than giving it to a character, rather than putting it in the mouth of a character. Why shouldn't Sordello be delivering this diatribe, or one of the princes? After all, we have St. Peter in Paradise 27 denouncing the Vatican. And instead, here the poet tears open the fabric of the dramatic narrative and allows his narrator to steal the voice from his characters. It's as if the narrator and the poet become one in this diatribe. He calls it a digression. I call it an apostrophe or a diatribe. And it's perhaps because of the urgency of the political moment, which is what we were discussing before. Dante believes that he has seen a vision of government that transforms and transcends the hellish reality that he observes around him. In the language of his epistles that he wrote to Henry VII, that he wrote to the Florentine governors, Dante seems to have assumed a mantle of an Old Testament prophet. This is the argument that Scott makes on the basis of the language of those letters. He sees Henry's mission as providential because only an emperor can restore peace to Italy. As I said, it's a blip on the historical timeline, but for Dante, it was very important. It was providential. The narrator turns first on personified Italy, and this is lines 76 to 79. Abject Italy, you inn of sorrows, you ship without a helmsman in harsh seas, no queen of provinces but of bordellos. He uses a language that captures the imagination of generations, of Petrarch, of Ariosto, of Leopardi, and it juxtaposes Jeremiah's lamentation for the capture of Jerusalem and ancient political rhetoric, the ship without a helmsman in a stormy sea. Serve Italia is no mistress of provinces, but a slave, a whore, a ship in a stormy sea without a pilot. And where once there was brotherhood and peace, now there is only war. Now men gnaw at each other. This is the next few lines. Within the city walls, and this is an obvious reference to Ugolino and Ruggiero in Hell. And he goes on to say that it's to our shame that Justinian renewed the law, that he fitted you out with a bridle when there's no emperor to ride in the saddle. In 91 to 96, I had it in Italian. Ai gente che dovresti esser devota. You who, if you understood what God ordained, would then attend to things devout. I'm not sure if that's translated. Ai gente che dovresti esser devota. And he's addressing the priest who should allow the emperor to mount the horse, for this is as God intended. The beast, the state of Italy, is savage without a rider. And again, the political idea is here is that, like the bridling of beasts and the steering of ships, there needs to be rational control over impulse of the individual, of the state. 97 to 117, O German Albert, you who have abandoned that steed, become recalcitrant and savage, etc. Dante is directing his wrath at the already deceased German Albert and his father and his son who predecease him. It's a kind of post factum curse. Albert, like his son, were murdered. And their greed had led them to neglect the Garden of Italy. This is what Dante is saying. He urges Albert, already deceased, to come and view the devastation of the great clans, both Ghibelline and Guelph. Vieni a veder Montecchi e Cappelletti in 106. Vieni crudel, vieni e vedi la pressura, and this is a word that's taken right from Luke, like Luke 21:25. The distress, the destruction. So, and here we see language that's more ornamental. Dante's using repetitions and anaphora and alliteration and biblical citations, this pressura. Vieni a veder la tua Roma, vieni a veder la tua gente. The widowed Rome occurs in 112, and this is an image that's everywhere in polemical literature of the time. And Dante makes effective use of widows, as you might remember. Rome is widowed, the church is widowed in 11 of Paradise, and poverty is widowed. He does it well. And in fact, Rome is bereft of both emperor, because Henry's, bereft of both emperor and pope at this time, because Clement, Clement established the papacy in Avignon in 1309, and he would remain in Avignon to 1314 at the time of his death. So there's neither pope nor emperor in poor widowed Rome right now. And finally, in lines 127 to 151, Dante pours out his most brutal scorn for his native city. And this is the Dante you would not want to have at your dinner table. We return to the game of Zara, to time that's not guided by rational governance or providential fortune, but by chance, by accident, by impulse, by greed. Rome is so rich and wise. Florence is so rich and wise, and every Florentine has justice at the tip of his tongue. Florence is so inspired by ancient democracy that the laws, the officials, the customs of October are discarded by mid-November. Florence is a sick woman in her bed, not knowing where to turn for comfort. This is not the best constructed invective, but certain images, Italy as a servant, as a harlot, as a sick woman tossing in her bed, as well as the verve of Dante's disgust, make it powerful and memorable. In fact, there are two poems that we can read as models for this outburst. And one is a lament written by Sordello, a lament for Lord Blancatz, southern French Lord Blancatz, by Sordello, who was a second-rate Italian poet of Provençal, who served Charles of Anjou. He was not one of the greatest Provençal poets. He was Italian from Mantova, and he wrote in Provençal. And Dante is scathing in his criticism of those who were negligent of their mother tongue, especially those who chose to write in Provençal, like Sordello. In both the De Vulgari Eloquentia and the Convivio, Dante denounces very harshly this poet, Sordello. In fact, his behavior here is the opposite of his behavior in life, his greeting of his fellow Mantuan. He had neglected to use the language of his fellow Mantuan, but he greets with great zeal his Virgil. And this is also true, for example, of proud Manfred, who died in Contumacia, who died in rebellion against the church, and yet is described as a pecorella. He's described as a little sheep. This is not the Manfred we know and love from history. He's in Canto 3, on the shores of Purgatorio. So it seems that Dante has chosen this strategy deliberately. But to return to Sordello, with the exception of the first stanza of his lament, which eulogizes Blancatz, the poem is an attack on the leaders of Europe. So it begins as what we call a plagna, a lament at the death of a lord, and then it becomes a Cervantes, a political poet. And he criticizes the leaders who have failed to defend their territory. And what he recommends is that the heart of Blancatz be cut into little pieces, and that each of the various leaders of Europe be given a piece, be served a piece, so that they could, on eating the piece, become more, a piece of Blancatz's heart, become more courageous. Planier voi en Blancatz en aquest léger so is the name of the song. And the other model for this invective of Dante is a canzone by Guitone d'Arezzo. And Professor Barolini was the first to recognize this, so it's very important. This canzone, or poem, it's a long poem, a canzone, is directed to Count Ugolino and Nino Visconti. You know Ugolino? We're going to meet Visconti in the next canto. In Canto 7, Dante is going to be delighted to see him there. He's actually Ugolino's grandson. Guitone calls upon these two men, great lords and almost kings, magni baroni, certo e reggi quasi, to come to the aid of Pisa. To give you some brief paraphrases, Pisa is sick, my lords, the beautiful lady, mother of you and yours, the greatest lady of the province, indeed a queen, has become almost a serving girl. And the reason for this is the lack of virtue of the leaders in Pisa. And Guitone insists that greatness is defined as in terms of goodness, not in terms of wealth or power. He says, please do not behave like tyrant destroyers, but like good Romans in whom there is true valor. So we hear so much of Dante in this canzone of Guitone d'Arezzo, and Dante hated Guitone, maybe because of the long shadow that he cast. Guittone was the first vernacular poet to join love and Christian virtue in a vernacular poem. He was the most important poet in Italy during Dante's youth. Oh, he died around 92, I think. And quite frankly, he was a terrible poet. I've read all of Guittone. I studied Guittone. He's a terrible poet, but he's a failed poet with great intentions. And we see why Dante is so outspoken. I think we can put this invective in perspective when we think about it in terms of the two poems that may have influenced in some way. We see why Dante is so outstanding when we look at this invective, even this invective which is rather poorly constructed and relying more on rhetorical figures for articulation than logic. Sordello uses a medieval conceit of heart-eating, and Guittone buries his message in elaborate linguistic ornamentation. But Dante, this poet in exile, always imagines himself in the piazza. He's on a soapbox. And for all of his tremendous erudition, his language remains direct and clear and powerful, which is why I think we still read it. And now we're going to read the canto. Purgatorio 6. Quando si parte il gioco della tara, colui che perde si rimando lente, ripetendo le volte e tristo impara. Con l'altro se ne va tutta la gente, qual va dinanzi e qual di dietro il prende, e qual da lato gli si recca mente. El non s'arreste, queste quel intende, a cui porge la man più non la pressa, e così della calca si difende. Tale rio in quella turba spessa, volgendo allora qua e là la faccia, e promettendomi sciogliea da essa. Qui vi era l'aretin, che dalle braccia fiere di ghinditacco ebbe la morte, e l'altro c'annegò correndo in caccia. Qui vi pregava con le mani sporte Federigo Novello, e quel da Pisa che fe parer lo buon Marzucco forte. Vidi Contor orso, e l'anima divisa dal corpo suo per aste per invegia, come dicea, non per colpa commissa, pier della broccia dico. E qui proveggia mentre qua e di qua la donna di Brabante, sì che però non si di peggior greggia. Come libero fui da tutte quante quell'ombre che pregar pur che altri prieghi, sì che s'avvacci lor divenir sante. Io cominciai. El par che tu mi nieghi, o luce mia, espresso in alcun testo che decreto il ciel o razon pieghi. E questa gente prega pur di questo. Sarebbe dunque loro spemme vanna, o non m'el detto tu, o ben manifesto? Ed è la mia scrittura è piana, e la speranza di costor non falla, se ben si guarda con la mente sanna. Che cima di giudicio non s'avalla, perché fuoco d'amor compie in un punto ciò che dee soddisfar chi qui s'astalla. E là, dov'io fermai codesto punto, non s'amendeva per pregar difetto, perché il prego da Dio era disgiunto. Veramente a così alto sospetto non ti fermar, se quella nol ti dice che lume fia tra il vero e l'intelletto. Non so se intendi, io dico di Beatrice. Tu la vedrai di sopra, in sulla vetta di questo monte, ridere felice. E io, oh, Signore, andiamo a maggior fretta, che già non m'affatico come dinanzi, e vedi ormai che il poggio l'ombra getta. Noi anderemo con questo giorno innanzi, rispose, quanto potremo ormai, quanto più potremo ormai, ma il fatto è d'altra forma che non stanzi. Prima che sia lassù, tornar vedrai colui che già si copre della costa, sì che suoi raggi tu romper non fai. Ma vedi là, un'anima che, posta sola soletta, in verso noi riguarda. Quella ne insegnerà la via più tosta. Venimo a lei, o anima lombarda, che ti stavi altera e disdegnosa e nel mover degli occhi onesta e tarda. Ella non ci diceva alcuna cosa, ma lasciavane gir, solo sguardando a guisa di leon quando si posa. Pur Virgilio si trasse a lei pregando che ne mostrasse la miglior salita, e quella non rispose al suo dimando, ma di nostro paese e della vita che inchiese. E il dolce duca incominciava: Mantua, e l'ombra, tutta in sé romita, sorse ver lui, dal loco ove pria stava dicendo: «Oh, Mantuano, io son sordello della tua terra», e l'un l'altro abbracciava. Acqua. Ai, servi Italia, di dolor ostello, nave senza nocchiere in gran tempesta, non donna di province ma bordello. Quell'anima gentil fu così presta, sol per lo dolce suon della sua terra, di far al cittadin suo quivi festa. E or in te non stanno senza guerra li vivi tuoi, e l'un l'altro si rode, di quei qu'un muro e una fessa sera. Cerca, misera, intorno delle prode, le tue marine, e poi ti guarda in seno s'alcuna parte in te di pace gode. Che val perché ti racconciasse il freno Justiniano se la sella è vota? Sans esso farà la vergogna meno. Ai, gente, che dovresti essere devota e lasciar seder Cesare in la sella, se bene intendi ciò che Dio ti nota. Guarda come esta fiera è fatta fella per non esser corretta dagli sproni, poiché ponesti mano alla predella. O Alberto tedesco, c'abbandoni costei, che fatta indomita e selvaggia, e dovresti inforcar gli suoi arcioni. Giusto giudicio delle stelle caggia sovra il tuo sangue, e sia nuovo e aperto, tal che il tuo successor te menzannaggia. Che avete tu e il tuo padre sofferto per cupidigia di costà distretti, che il giardin dello impero sia deserto? Vieni a veder Montecchi e Capelletti, Monaldi e Filippeschi, uomo senza cura, color già tristi e quei con sospetti. Vien, crudel, vieni e vedi la pressura di tuoi gentili, e cura lo maganni, e vedrai Santa Fior come oscura. Vieni a veder la tua Roma che piagne vedova e sola, e di notte chiama: Cesare mio, perché non m'accompagni? Vieni a veder la gente quanto s'ama, e se nulla di noi pietà ti muove, a vergogna ti vien della tua fama. I think I forgot to say this. This is the boldest part. Somehow I left it out. E se licita me, o sommo Giove, che fosti in terra per noi crucifisso, son li giusti occhi tuoi rivolti altrove? O è preparazione che nell'abissa del tuo consiglio fai per alcun bene in tutto dell'accorgiar nostro sciso? Che le città d'Italia tutte piene son di tiranni, e un marcel diventa ogni villan che parteggiando viene. Firenze mia, ben puoi essere contenta. di questa digressione che non ti tocca. Mercé del popolo tuo che si argomenta. Molti han giustizia in cuori e tardi scocca per non venire senza consiglio all'arco, ma il popolo tuo l'ha in sommo della bocca. Molti rifiutan lo comune incarico, ma il popolo tuo sollecito risponde senza chiamare grida, io mi sobborgo. Or ti fa lieta che tu hai ben onde, tu ricca, tu con pace e tu con senno. Se io ti dico ver, l'effetto non lo nasconde. Atene Lacedomena, Aten e Lacedemona, che fenno l'antiche leggi e furon sì civili, fecero viver bene un piccolo cenno verso di te, che fai tanto sottili provvedimenti che al mezzo novembre non giugno quel che tu d'ottobre fili. Quante volte del tempo che rimembri, legge, moneta, offici, costumi hai tu mutato e rinnovate membri. E se ben ti ricordi e vedi lume, vedrai te somigliante a quella inferma che non può trovar posa in sulle piume, ma con dar volta suo dolor schema. Trip me up. So now I invite you to ask questions. I realize we forgot to talk about some of the details. Yes, Vincent.
Thank you so much. I love your talk, and I'm going to play the devil's advocate.
I expected it.
Why do you say that the digression, as he calls it, is ill-constructed? Is it simply a professional deformation on my part? You put a text in front of us and we find structure in it, that I think that it's well-constructed, or what do you think?
Well, I thought about it for a long time, and I felt that the movement from Italy to the church to the Roman Empire, Roman emperors, was not really very coherent. I thought that often he was just simply using anaphora. If you think about Pietro's denunciation or many other denunciations, they seem much more coherent to me. And it seemed like he almost had a laundry list, short one, of topics that he wanted to cover. And I didn't feel that it was Dante's most coherent argument, but he needed to turn to all of these different elements in civil society and on the international scene. And that's why. For a long time, I was not impressed by it, but then when I started thinking about it of course it's very powerful, but when I started thinking about it in relation to these other poems, I understood why it works so well, because the language is very powerful, but I just don't see the development of a really coherent argument here. Of course, all the pieces do fit together, but it's a bunch of cliches. They're done so well.
Do you not see a progression toward the familiar? It seems to me that there are different levels of styles. He sort of starts out in the high style that Peter uses, but then he gets out at the end. It's almost like he's sitting opposite a child and thrusting his.
Well, I'm willing to entertain that notion, a progression in style, from a high style really to a very immediate, that's a guttural, visceral style. I can see that.
Trivial as it gets more immediate, if you like, but all the trivial things exemplify the great.
Yes, I can see that. I can see that. Nevertheless, compared to the two other poems, it's so powerful. The images he used are those that stick to our memory, as Professor Bolzoni was saying the other day. They cling to our memory because they're so powerful and moving. And they were taken up by patriots throughout Italian history. It doesn't waste any words in this. Maybe that's why. These ideas are just juxtaposed and there's no development.
There are phases, though, it seems to me.
I'm willing to accept that I was too harsh.
He's trying to, it's like he's getting no answer, and so he comes at it from another.
Okay. I do accept
But
that.
I see the facts as you see them, no question. But I mean, I think I probably would put them together.
Next time around, I'm going to modify my opinion of this. Did you have a question? Yes.
Yes, I'm confused about Sordello. Maybe you could enlighten me. Here it seems that Sordello is introduced as a figure of great respect and is used as a springboard toward invading against all the forces that have divided Italy. And yet, again, as I understand it, Sordello was a protege of Charles of Anjou, who in turn was a protege of the Pope. And Charles of Anjou was fighting in Italy against the emperor and causing all sorts of division. And thus it seems to me that the character of Sordello in the poem must be very different from the real character of Sordello. So I see that.
That's absolutely true. And worse than any of those biographical elements that you raise, and there are many that are associated. There are quite a few interesting stories associated with Sordello, but he wrote in Provençal rather than trying to nurture the vernacular of Mantua, which is the worst crime according to Dante. And yet most of these characters that he's meeting in the anti-Purgatorio are almost the opposite of what they were in life. I use the example of Manfred, who exhibits humility. And that is something that he never, he died in open rebellion with the church. And
An accident, or is there some hidden literary or poetic craft behind
I don't think it's, did you want to answer, Todd?
I would just say it's to didactic purpose because purgatory is the place of reformation.
Yes.
So
You have to begin somewhere.
of people that would never be there, you would think, and yet they are, but because at the last moment or whatever they have called upon divine aid and repented, and now they're beginning their turnaround.
But that's an easier argument to make with Manfred than with Sordello. It's only that Dante's made a turnaround. Dante saves Sordello, whom he's called a harlot in the Convivio because he used the language of the Provençal to write. Yes, it's to didactic purpose. Even you can be saved.
But he does seem more clear.
He does see, Dante has grown. He dropped the Convivio and he puts, in this canto, he puts together Guelphs and Ghibellines. And he asks the emperors to come and see the destruction that has been wrought on Guelphs and Ghibellines, on clans of every stripe. He's beyond the anger and the partisan vision, even in terms of language that he once had. He includes Provençal in Purgatorio, as Vincent will be showing us.
In what, 3 years?
Oh yeah, about 3 years. I was so clear, I was so confusing.
You were wonderfully clear.
Yes, Sandy.
So I wanted to finish off with this subject. I wanted to talk about the first setting, first 3 lines. The loser. We open up with this loser, not the loser, but this one loser. I wonder who is the loser in this game? Because we talked a lot about it. And if we think about all the characters who are present at this moment, only one of them will not get to paradise. That's virgin.
Well, that is true, but I don't see the terza being used that way. I really see it being this whole extended simile being used to talk about the fact that Italian politics has turned into a game of chance. You win or you lose. There's no rhyme or reason to it. It's not fortune, it's not providence. So yes, but I don't see that. I don't see that as, I don't know, maybe someone else does. Father Mbelli, yes?
As we're reading the Italian, pause just before line 118.
Oh, yeah.
Because those were the lines that struck me the most. The juxtaposition of Jupiter and crucified.
This is not the only time that Dante refers to God as Jove, but it's the only time when he refers to, essentially to Christ and only Christ as Jove. This is the only time in the comedy. And his line, "Se licito me, o somo Giove," that's actually part of the rhetorical tradition. This kind of apostrophe to God, which seems completely off limits, with the excuse that this may not be permitted, is actually mentioned by Geoffrey of Vanself in the Poetria Nova. Well, I don't really have too much else to say. That Dante asks, "Is your gaze elsewhere?" And then he describes Italy with every partisan a new Marcellus who may be that may be a character to a reference to an opponent of Caesar in Lucan's Pharsalia. But I don't know what else to say about that. Dante was using every rhetorical means available, including this one, and this is very, for me, almost shocking. It's the Dante, it makes sense to turn to the emperor and to the Florentines and to the popes, but to turn to God and accuse God of not minding what he should be minding, or she, or whatever, is quite, how do you respond to it?
Well, again, it was just a juxtaposition of the Roman deity. One of the notes said, a certain accidents between Jehovah and Job. But as you said, but here it's Christ. It's not God the Father, it's Christ. And it's not only Christ, it's the crucified. So it just struck me. I don't know
It's very striking. But what is great about this invective, despite its poor construction, is all of the images that are striking and that we are going to remember. I mean, that's why it's so powerful. He's just, these short lines are filled with images that are extremely powerful, including this one. Yes?
I think he's saying that Christ's understanding way beyond any human possibility of understanding. That seems to be what the words say, a good that we cannot foresee, dissevered from our way of understanding.
But he's also almost blaming Christ for this, because he said there's such chaos in Italy. So is this good that you're preparing, is this a good you're preparing that is so profound that we can't begin to comprehend it?
I think he's saying that's the nature of things.
But it's hard to not see an edge on that. This is part of the invective. This is part of the anger. Yes?
This image of Jupiter crucified, that's a shocking image. But it calls to mind, I may be way off because my mythology is not all that. But I think Jupiter came to power by imprisoning the giants. We saw the giants chained in the well in Purgatorio and hell and Inferno. And now we have the image of Jupiter himself being crucified. Of course, the whole point is that he rises beyond it as Christ.
That's a very good, not analogy, but reference to make to it. This violence that is associated with Jupiter. But now Jupiter is the suffering one. Now Jupiter is Christ. And it is, he is and he isn't, of course. He's using Jove to name Christ. Yes?
I guess I'd like to take back to your opening remarks about the providentiality of the empire and the church. And I wonder if by giving God his Roman name, followed not long thereafter by the mention of Marcellus, the poet isn't reminding us again of the providentiality of the empire.
I mean, he could say Christ, he does refer to Christ, but yes, I think that's absolutely true. the providentiality of the Roman Empire, under which Christ was crucified and man was saved. Yes, I think so. Were you going to?
Well, I was just going to say also the lynching reference suddenly of the crucified Christ sort of goes with his indictment of humanity, as if you haven't made enough of a mess of everything. Remember that after all, he did crucify Christ on top of it, so mankind is quite capable of wrecking everything. In the sense that.
But it was divinely ordained.
Yeah.
But then what else? Is this mess on earth divinely ordained? Oh yes, it's a profound questioning.
I presume that when he apostophizes Florence from 127 to 142, that's all dripping sarcasm.
You presume correctly.
Right, and he doesn't spin and turn it around until he says, and every thread that you spin, you unspin the next moment. So.
That's right. Dripping sarcasm is the word I was looking for. Yes?
I think that the characteristics of this outburst, the incoherence and the outraged passion and the expression of ignorance and confusion, is Dante, the poet's expression of his own limits. And maybe this is artistically necessary, that, here we've got Dante the poet creating the Divine Comedy and showing Dante the Pilgrim all kinds of things that Dante the Pilgrim doesn't know, but Dante the poet tells him. But perhaps he has to diminish himself, make himself confused, tormented, to really to achieve the unity with pilgrim and poet that is necessary, because I think if we proceed to genuinely sincere.
I think that's a really wonderful intuition. I don't really think that he is confused, but he is expressing tremendous anger, wrath across the board, even to heaven. And yes, I think, yes, this the almost unfinished quality or imperfect quality that I perceive, I think may be part of the artistic expression of his anger and of the urgency of the moment. I think that's a very good intuition. Yes, Bennett.
Here's some faint aura of a united Italy, an Italy not as a part of an empire, but as a unified geographic and political entity.
Well, this was used to make that argument. This invective was used to make that argument, but I don't think that there's any hint of it here. Because right in the middle of Italy were the Papal States, and not even Dante believed, well, he does fight the donation of Constantine. He does argue against donation of Constantine. What do you think, Todd?
Well, I think certainly there's it's not the Risorgimento view of a nation state, but it certainly is, that of Dante's understanding of the classical Italy as being the providential home of the Roman Empire.
Right. That's
Now, Doni di Province is what it should be, and of course then, Germany shouldn't be the seat of the emperor out back, though. It should be a provincia.
these people without laws. Instead, we are the people without laws, but we on the other side of the Alps, yes, we should be. Yes, I think that does underlie it, the United Italic Peninsula. But it's not really, it's hard to think of a united Italy, a Risorgimento united Italy, but to think of the Italic people as one, it is there, and it is returning to the ancient vision of Italy.
That's what the emperor's going to do.
That's what the emperor is going to do.
He fulfills his divinely appointed duty. He's going to unite Italy. Let the church go back to being the church,
And you're absolutely right. It should not be Alberto Tedesco who's doing it. It should be Alberto Romano, or at least, yes. But it's still, we're very far, I think, from the modern state, the idea of the modern state. That's the one thing I believe that, although this, as I said, it was used. This invective was certainly used. Were there any other questions? Well, thank you so much for coming, and we will meet. An old friend, Francesco Castellano, will be reading next month, Canto 7, continuing with Sordello, and we'll be meeting downstairs in 026. We'll put up signs, so if you come right here, we'll put up signs. Buonanotte.